guys! Okay, so while I was on the book tour, I read quite a few books just because we were traveling a lot, we were flying, and we were in the car for a long time, kind of going to hotels and stuff. So I read a lot of books. Plus, I was like on a book tour, so I was in a lot of bookstores, and I feel like I was just in a very like reading zone, if that makes any sense. So I have quite a few glitteratures coming up, and I'm going to start with the very first one that I read and finished, and that is The Kill Order by James Dashner. This is the prequel to The Maze Runner and then The Scorch Trials and then The Death Cure. So I mentioned this in my previous Glitterature haul, my most recent one, and this is the very first one I read. But there were very mixed reviews on this book. I had a couple people tweet me that they were disappointed in it, that they thought it was going to be better, so I was excited to read it, but there was a part of me that was like, well, if it's not any good, I'm going to be kind of bummed because I loved the series so much. But I loved this. I don't know what people were talking about. Now, I didn't really like The Death Cure, which was the third book, well, the fourth if you include this one in the four. It was the very last book of the series, and I just feel like compared to The Maze Runner and The Scorch Trials, it just wasn't done as well as I wish that it had been done. But this book I thought was just as good as the first two books. So this one to me was not a letdown at all. It's basically a prequel to The Maze. So if you read The Maze Runner, which you probably should read those books first, even though this one comes first, you kind of almost need to read it in the order they were written, just because they make a lot of references to the maze. And the end of this book actually is a little bit of a, it's not a cliffhanger because it's not meant to be written into more books, but it's almost like a little bit of an inside, not an inside joke, but it's like an inside detail that you wouldn't understand unless you had already read the rest of the series, if that makes sense. So the ending of it would be probably a little bit of a letdown if you didn't already know what was going to happen in the future. So the premise of this book is it explains what happens with the solar flares, how the disease gets out of hand, and how they decide that they need to form Wicked and then form the maze and do all these tests to cure the flare, which is the disease. So it definitely has a lot of new characters because these are the characters that exist way before Wicked's even formed. A lot of these people, obviously, this is not a spoiler, but a lot of them die off throughout the story because this is a very harsh world. Basically, out of nowhere, the sun, there's like solar flares that like heat up the earth and kill most of humanity. It just instantly kills people with the heat and the radiation. It's like 150 degrees or something all of a sudden, and everyone's like, everything's catching on fire and everyone's burning. And the characters that the basis of the book is on, the book follows the characters that were actually in a subway train at the time of the solar flares. They were underground, and that is how they survived the solar flares, because a lot of people that were just on the surface of the earth died instantly or the radiation killed them. These people happened to be underground, so they were kind of lucky in that sense, but unlucky in certain senses too, because the world has turned into a desert that is super hot and super dangerous. And a lot of the people that have survived are going crazy and they're beating each other up because there's no structure to civilization anymore. There's no policemen, there's no one manning any of the stores, there's just chaos everywhere. And so people are just going crazy and killing each other and running around. They act like they've all turned insane, even though they're just normal people at this point. They're just scared because, you know, the earth has basically ended. Sorry, I just got a text message. So the book kind of goes back and forth with two different time periods. You have flashbacks to the time of the actual flares happening, the solar flares, when they're in the subway car and kind of figuring out where they go from there. And then it's going back and forth with like a year later, I think, or it might be like a few years later, I don't know, where they're kind of, the people that have survived have formed like their own new civilization. It's like these mystery people that are shooting them with darts. That's the disease that then turns into the flare in the Maze Runner like trilogy, and the flare is the disease. So it's kind of confusing because it's like the solar flares are from the sun, but then the flare is the disease, and that's what makes you like basically turn into a crazy zombie and you eat people. It's like really post-apocalyptic, like just craziness. And then Wicked's formed and the maze is formed in order to find a cure for the flare, which is released in this book. So it just kind of fills in a lot of the holes from the Maze Runner trilogy. If you've read that and you're kind of curious, like, what happened when the solar flares happened and what happened with the flare, why are people crazy, where did the flare come from. This book answers a lot of those questions. I think it was done really well. I was traveling with Blair and my friend Nosif, and neither of them were reading the book, but I was, and we were on the book tour, and I would keep telling them, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm reading about the solar flares. And it's funny because like every time I was reading throughout the entire book tour, even when I was reading another book, because I read this one first, but I read like 5 books on the book tour, they'd be like, oh, Elle's reading about the solar flares, because I just was like really into it and I wanted to talk about it all the time, and they weren't reading it, so they didn't get it, so they were just like, okay, Elle, you and your solar flare book, go over there. But I definitely recommend it. I recommend the entire series with the exception of the Death Care, which was a little bit of a letdown for me, but still totally necessary to read if you're going to read the series. It's not terrible. I don't want you guys to think that I hated that book or anything. I just didn't think it was quite as good as the other 3 books. But this is a great series if it sounds interesting to you, if you're into dystopian, post-apocalyptic type societies, then it's really interesting. And The Maze Runner was the best one of all of them. I was so hooked on that series, and I have a Glitterature on that and the Scorch trials, so I will link them below if you want to read, if you've read them or if you haven't seen those videos, or if you want to know more about those particular books. I will link the Glitteratures below. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and there will be lots more Glitteratures coming up because I read a lot of books in the last few weeks. So I'll see you guys later. Bye.